Hello ladies and gentlemen, Adam Steele from Hot Pole Studios here, and today we're going to talk about this little baby. This is a new interface from Audient. This is the Sono. This is an interface that I think is going to be a big game changer for home recording enthusiasts, especially guitar players on some kind of budget who still want a lot of quality. So let's unbox it, get it going, check out what it can do. So the first thing we're going to do is get this out of its box and show you what it comes with. While I do this, I wanted to say a big thanks to Audient for sending me this. I have this before it's released to the wider world. I'm part of the beta kind of testing program, if you will. Big props to Audient. They have been very receptive, and anything that's come up, they've not just kind of gone whatever, they've actually fixed things. And as far as a company ethos goes, I think that's fantastic. So, as we open this up, it looks very pretty indeed. I do like the colour scheme on this, and it comes kind of floating, so it's not going to get damaged in transit. So, let's pull her out. So, it comes with these cheeks. Let's get this out of its packaging. Check that out. Isn't that a beauty? So some of the things that really interest me here, there are a lot more controls on here than there are on your average audio interface, and we'll get to why in a minute. There are kind of your average looking number of connections on the back, and there are a couple on the front, including one that really surprised me and I think is going to be the big game changer for guitarists. So what does it come with? We'll just talk about that briefly. It comes with a 12-volt power supply with all the different types of connections that you might possibly need in your country. I am always impressed when companies make power supplies that work on any voltage in any region, because it means that if you buy it, you know it's going to work. Also comes with a USB-A cable, which is in there, which is connected USB-C on the Sono to the good old square USB. And also, if you're running something like a modern MacBook Air that only has USB-C, this comes with a USB-C to C cable. So no matter what device you have, you don't need some awful adapter dongle, you can just grab one of them. Again, Audient have thought ahead. Rather than making you get special adapters and dongles and all that kind of stuff, every option is covered. I think that's really quite nice. So, let's have a brief look at this before we plug it in and turn it on. So, there's mic 1 and 2, so there are two microphone inputs that can also act as line inputs, both with separate 48-volt phantom power, which I really appreciate, because say you've got a ribbon microphone on one channel, you don't want to feed 48 volts phantom power to that, and a lot of the lower cost interfaces share their phantom power across all their mic inputs. That's potentially dangerous, so having it separate there is something I really quite value. There is left and right outputs for the speakers. There's the USB-C, which is not Thunderbolt, you've got to make that clear, even though they can use the same connection type. I would in future like to see Audient maybe make a Thunderbolt version of this, but that would be a different thing, and Thunderbolt does make for an extra cost, which makes for a more expensive interface. And also, not every computer has it. I like the idea of Thunderbolt, and I've talked about why USB for audio is going to die at some point soon, but it hasn't yet. And the 12 volts. As far as I know, the Sono doesn't work without the 12 volts, and that's because of this thing in the front. It's got a 12AX7. For those of you who are not technically minded, that is a valve, a preamp valve, a tube if you will. That's the next thing to talk about. The first input has a guitar input here, so it's got a DI, a guitar DI. We'll see how good that is, but as far as Audient's previous interfaces go, I'm going to go ahead and say that's going to be really high quality. But there's a button that says to valve. Now, that's where it gets interesting, because I don't know if that only affects the microphone on channel 1 yet and line, or if it affects the DI as well, but that sends the DI, or possibly the microphone, to a valve drive section with separate input and output, which has bass, mid and treble EQ. Then it gets really, really clever, because then the drive here, I thought was preamp drive originally. It's not. It's simulated power amp drive from the company 2 Notes Audio Engineering. I am wearing a 2 Notes t-shirt right now. I do work with them quite a bit separately from this, and I was quite shocked and pleasantly surprised to find that they'd worked with Audient on this. There is also the bit that for guitarists is the massive thing for me, is that 2 Notes Audio Engineering are known for their cabinet modelling through their Torpedo series, and you can load 3 of their Torpedo cabinets in here and use it without software. Now that's the game changer, because that means that you can have it with no latency, really. You can do it practically 0 latency and have the preamp, have the power amp, have the guitar cabinet all running in real time. That's quite a big game changer for me. So microphone input 2 or line input 2 is kind of straight stock, clean and clear, does what it says. There's the optical input as well, which I skimmed over before, which means you can have an extra 8 channels coming into this, so you can use 10 channels at once, which means that within reason you can record a drum kit with plenty of channels. I mean, if you're going for a crazy setup, you'd need something bigger, but if you're going for a crazy setup, you're probably not looking at kind of a desktop interface. You're probably looking at something in the next price bracket, something with an extra 0 on the price. The big game changer for me personally is next to the DI is an output that says 2 amp. Now 2 amp means that this has been designed in such a way that it's sending a very different signal than just a regular line output. This is what I would call a reamp out. Now if this has been done right, this is electrically isolated so that when you plug this straight into a real guitar amp, it doesn't buzz, it doesn't hum, and then you can send your clean original DI tracks back out to a guitar amp and then feed that through the amp and then through some microphones back into these channels and do reamping at home on your own with the highest possible quality and without having to buy a separate reamp box, which is what I've always recommended in the past because there hasn't really been any other option if you wanted that kind of proper quality. So let's plug it in and check it out. So here I am with the Sono in front of me set up, turned on, and the laptop as well set up so that you can see my screen, so that when I do interesting things you can see exactly what I'm doing, and a few other things dotted around it as well. So there are a lot of things that the Sono does which are practically identical in every way to the other Audient interfaces and other interfaces in that category, which is to say it has 2 microphone inputs, it's got a headphone out as well as master outputs. It's got a blend mix between the input and what's coming out of the DAW, so you can do live monitoring. Those are all basic and well and good. But there is so much more packed in here. So this sounds like a tube preamp with a tube power amp and a cabinet. Basically, if you're a guitarist, this sounds like a rig ready to go. So why would you need any of that in the first place? Let's take it back a little. So this Telecaster I've got is plugged into a Tube Screamery type pedal. This is essentially a Tube Screamer 808 for those who are into that kind of thing. And then I've gone into the most basic DI box I could find into channel 2. And so the reason I'm doing this is to demonstrate how things sound without any of the stuff that the Sono does. So this is the most basic sound of the Telecaster. So it sounds okay, but it sounds flat, it sounds dry, it sounds like there's no life to it at all. And that's because what you're hearing is just the pickups from this straight into a DI box, nothing else done to it. Pristine, clean conversion to digital. That's it. Done. Nothing else. And if I was to turn the tube screamer on to make matters worse, it sounds like this. It sounds mushy, it sounds muffly, it doesn't do what you would expect it to do because it's not in front of an amp. This is where the DI on the Sono comes in. So if I plug this little setup of this pedal and this guitar straight into the front of this, there is a 12AX7 preamp tube in there. And the first thing that we do, if I crank up the input, is we go. And that sounds a million miles better and is coming straight from the Sono. That's not in software on the laptop. I could completely unplug the laptop here and that would run on its own. And that, if you don't play heavy guitar, that's probably all you need. And if I turn on this tube screamer as well, suddenly it sounds like an amp. And that's because it's designed to. Now let's show you what's happening here by going into the Torpedo remote software that comes with the Sono. And this is the setup that is currently happening on the Sono. This is the Torpedo remote software, and all this is doing is controlling what's happening on the Sono. If I was to unplug the USB here, it would carry on as if nothing had happened. Now, if you've seen the Two Notes Torpedo stuff before, or their Wall of Sound software, this may look quite simplistic. And I think that's a good thing in this context, that we've got a choice of cabinet here, which we can choose at the top. There's a big list. There's 1x12s, 1x15s, 2x12s, 4x12s, including, I'll just turn off the online aspect because you can download and buy them. There are quite a few that I have made, including the Big Beast, which is a Zilla 4x12, which of course I would highly recommend. I am biased. But there are also 2x12s. Let's pull up our second preset, which is... So the choices you have, firstly there's the power amp, which if I turn that off, it'll suddenly sound quite cold. But when you turn up the drive knob on the Sono, you'll see it also changes in the Torpedo remote software to reflect that. So if we go from it being quite a cold power amp but still being on, you can see that suddenly goes from not having any character to having quite a big punch. And as we turn it up to being hot, that really starts to add some guts. Now the bass, middle and treble on the Sono I've not really talked about yet. They seem to be controlling the preamp stage. So if I get a bit more treble, bit more mid, bit less bass, up the tone a bit on the tube screamer just to get a bit more bite out of this, and back the drive off on that power amp a little. There's also a tone between dark and bright, so we can darken things up. personally like it to be quite bright. Now down here is where we choose what microphone we want. So we've got 421, 57. Let's go with the Gemini. Now this is with the input on full. Something that's interesting to note is this: when you plug into the DI, takes over channel 1. Anything that's been plugged into the microphone input is just disconnected through some kind of relay, which means that if I try and play with the gain here, it does absolutely nothing because the gain has been shifted from here to the input. And that's pushing the 12AX7 that's in here. There is, of course, an output knob as well. And the levels we can see on here. This really is aimed at guitarists rather than audio nerds like me. Because it says signal, some, good, hot, bad. Rather than giving you numbers of decibels, which can be quite handy. If I crank my volume up here, let's see what level we're getting. So as I hit that quite hard, I get a hot level, and it doesn't say bad, so it's not clipping, which is a good thing. So, what else have we got? This close and far is one of the most important ones for me in this control set, because if you're completely close, that essentially turns off the reverb that's in the Sono. And if you're far, it changes to the further microphone emulations, but also adds the room sound in. Which is important because there are different rooms. So there's Studio B, which is one of my favourites. There's the basement. Bring that back to maybe 50%. There's the loft. Hall A is one of my favourites as well. There's Hall B, which is less reverberant. The crypt. The really overblown cathedral, of course. Let's say we take that way down, so we're much closer to the amp, but we still get some of that. So that's pretty cool. Now let's look at the contour, because the contour all the way off is very mid-focus, very punchy. I can't see many people wanting to use it all the way vintage, but you never know. But closer to modern, it takes some mids out, gives it a brightness scoop. So you can go to some really quite nice sounds here. Something I have noticed is the overall input can be quite low, especially something with a low output set of pickups. But I think that that's a design choice so that if you've got particularly hot pickups or pedals with quite a loud output, you're not just going to automatically get clipping, which I would imagine a lot of the guitar players that are going to get one of these are going to be doing. They're going to be driving it pretty hard. Okay, so now we're taking it to the next level. So I'm on my Les Paul, but I've put in my 2 notes lead. This is a preamp that's now in front of another preamp, but this one I'm using essentially as a distortion box. So what I'm actually doing here is a slightly complicated routing. As you can see on screen, if I take away the performance meter here, I'm going from my guitar into this DI. This is a Behringer Ultra G. I'm intending to put a radial or something in this patch at some point, but that is recording on the channel 2 that you can see down there a completely clean DI that is currently muted, and I'm keeping that for safekeeping for later on. Now that's been patched through to the lead. Now the lead is giving me that heavy gain, but on its own it would sound absolutely terrible. So what I'm doing is I'm going through the torpedo, and here's what we're doing. So the remote is going through to the power amp, which has quite a bit of drive on. If I turn the drive off on the power amp, and this is the 2 notes technology, I believe, if I turn that off, it sounds like this. But as I turn that up, that gets more realistic. As we go too far with this kind of sound, you probably don't want that because it suddenly starts to sound woolly and mushy. So with a heavy sound, you probably want kind of a medium amount of that power amp saturation to get that. So I've got my input on the Sono just above 12 o'clock, and I'm hitting it with some good volume from the lead, but if I turn that off, still got a relatively usable clean tone, but then I can go straight into... I've got the tone just above 50%. The distance is pretty much none, so the mic's right on the cab. I'm using a 421 with a contour slightly towards modern, and that's it. So I'm going to save that onto the Sono as one of the 3 presets. In fact, let's do that now. Save preset number 1. Let's call it 4x12. It's called 57. I'll change that here to 421 and save that again. And that's it. That is done. That cab, that mic, that setup. So what I can do now is I can record in Reaper or Logic or Pro Tools or whatever it is that I'm going to be using. In this case, it's Reaper, with no plugins at all. No processing power required, which means I could do 100 tracks of this and just play them back, and as long as the hard drive can keep up, the rest of the computer doesn't need to do any work at all. This could be good either for tracking at home if you're keeping a DI like I am, or for writing, or if you're happy with this as your main sound, that's it, you're done. Let's maybe take a little treble off that and maybe a bit more drive back. Yeah, so if I record a couple of bits here now. Now that, if I play that back, that should give me exactly the same sound. Now, if I wanted to go one further and record this with, say, the tube preamp, but not with the 2 notes section, I'm not sure why, but maybe I want, let's say that I want to do this with something like 2 Notes Wall of Sound software as the cabinet emulation, so I've got more control, I'm a bit more nerdy, I'm more technical, I can do that. So I changed my record input from mic 1 to one that's further down the list. It's called No Cab, and that'll sound on its own pretty terrible. But that's where we add in a plugin on this channel, which in my case, I'm going to add in Wall of Sound by 2 Notes, which this is kind of the all singing, all dancing version of what's already built into the Sono, but you need the DAW to run it, you need to use it through the latency of the software, whether you're okay with that. You also would then need to know exactly what you're doing with this much more complicated setup, unless I went into arcade mode. So I can do it any which way that I please, and more importantly, I've captured this clean DI. If we solo this because of the way that I've routed this, that is going to be useful right now because of the next feature that I'm going to talk about on this, which is the reamp output feature. This seems like a massive game changer. So that little distorted piece that we just played over in the control room, we've now moved through to here. So this is where we're going to talk about the reamp functionality, because this is something that to me is a real game changer. Traditionally, if you wanted to record a guitar part and then send it out through to a big, loud amp again, you would need one of these. A reamp box. It's a clever little gadget that changes a line level output into something that resembles a guitar signal, whilst also isolating all the electronics so that you don't get any horrible hums and buzzes and bzzz kind of background noise. So usually you'd need to fork out for one of these. The Sono, however, has this functionality inbuilt. And this is a real, like I said, game changer, because this means that I can have an amp and speaker setup somewhere. I can record at home with that DI like you saw earlier, have some sort of tone that roughly matches what I'm going to do with zero latency so I can track properly. Then I can come out to wherever my amp is, and I can get that to make a lot of noise, put up to 2 microphones in front of it because there are 2 inputs on the Sono, or if I was using the ADAT input on the back of the optical as well, I could have up to 10 microphones on this. Not that I'm going to, but the option is there. So what we've done, let's take the amp off standby. As you can hear, it's pretty noisy, but that's this amp. If I take this reamp connection out, it's actually noisier without being plugged in. That's always a good sign. So something that you would notice if this amp was off is when you plug anything into this speaker output that says to amp on here, there's an audible click inside the Sono, and that is some relays changing what goes where in terms of the circuitry, which I thought was a very clever way of doing it. Now, if I look at Reaper, which I've already set up for this, I have this DI channel. I've made it a bit louder in Reaper just to make sure that it's feeding the amp at the proper volume. And if I bring up the mixer, you can see that I've changed the routing here. So I've changed it so that the master out is not being sent. So on the headphones or on the monitor outs, if you've got those plugged in, you won't then hear this DI going plinky plonky plonk. But there's an extra hardware output going out of one called Analog 3/2 amp. And the 2 amp is the important part, because that's this going into the front of this PV6505. That, if I press play, is why I've got these ear defenders, because this is going to get noisy. So, once I've done that, if I then have a new track, which I already have one that I've named Reamp SM57 because there's a 57 in front of one of these speakers here, I can then get that right, make sure the level coming in for that microphone is right, over and over and over, without me having to physically play, and then when that's right, I don't have to be in the same room as this necessarily, but seeing as though the Sono's right here and I'm right here, that's why we're doing it this way. Put on the ear defenders and hit record. So I've turned the amp on standby just so that I can think, because the background noise out of this thing, that's that amp. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to put these headphones on that I've plugged into the Sono, and I'm going to listen to the original Sono plus Le Lead. Then I'm going to listen to the SM57 that I've just recorded on a real amp. So there we have it. If I wasn't happy with that reamp sound, I could then move the microphone around, hit record again, do it over and over and over without having to change that performance. So if what I was playing, or the guitarist was playing, was perfect, then you don't have to play that again and again and again. You can get the right amp tone to match. And it sounds like the tone that I got from the Le Lead wasn't quite there, but that's something that I could work on and then get that set. But as long as I keep a copy of that super clean DI, then I can always send that back out of the 2 amp output and do this with it. And then you can put pedals in between the 2 amp and the amp. So you could boost in front of the amp, you could put, I don't know, chorus or whatever sound you want there, add whatever setup you want to this, and put up to 2 microphones on it, hit record, and do that again and again until you're happy with that sound without having to buy any extra hardware. I think that's the important point there, that the Sono is definitely not the cheapest interface I've seen, but I don't think I've ever seen another interface at this price point that has these kind of features. Moving on, let's do what I call the dreaded SM7 test. And then we'll move on to something a bit funky, because the whole tube thing and the cab thing, you can use that on microphone number 1. So let's check that out. Okay, so this is the good old SM7B test. I don't know where the foam's gone off it, but otherwise this is the usual test that I do. If you listen to the background noise, there practically isn't any, apart from there's a little bit from the laptop whirring away because it's doing a screen capture of all this at the same time, and it's only about a meter away from the microphone. So I'm trying my best not to do any big pops or anything like that, but you can hear that with the microphone gain on 10, it sounds pretty decent. Now, here's where we do the next test that isn't there on most interfaces. There is a button on the back that says to valve. So now we can hear a little bit of background noise, but that's because I've got the gain on 10, and that's now going into a valve gain section as well. You can suddenly hear how this is much brighter sounding. I could the treble, mid, and the bass all affect this channel. So this is sending the mic preamp into the tube DI section, kind of doing it backwards from what most interfaces do, which is what most interfaces would do, a DI into the mic preamp section. So this then has an input section, which if I do that with it, I can hear the background noise levels come up quite a lot. But you can actually hear my laptop whizzing more than anything. I've had to back off because I can hear on the headphones it's quite loud, and you can hear how it's distorting quite a bit now. If I back that off, you've got the output level to compensate for everything. But if I hit drive, this is where it gets interesting, because I can really start to make the drive. Is the drive doing anything? The drive seems no. The drive on its own isn't doing anything, but if I turn on the cab modelling, there we go. So this is where it can get quite interesting. So you really can hear a lot of the background stuff, but if I bring out some treble here, to take the mids down a bit, yeah, it's quite noisy. But if I wanted to do like a distorted amp-like effect on a vocal, this is it. I mean, this is live with no additional latency, if that's your thing. So I'm just going to turn that off because that's really quite off-putting to me. If that's your thing, the option is right there. Or, I don't know, maybe you've got something that's got an output that you want to drive like that, the option is there. I think that's pretty cool. So if there we go, take the valve back out, we get that super clean sound again, which is probably most times what I would use is the super clean kind of thing. And this is still through the SM7 with the gain absolutely whacked. So let's just change back to the normal shotgun mic for the conclusion of our little demonstration. So, in conclusion, the Sono is really pushing the boundaries of what an audio interface is supposed to be. I've reviewed the ID22 and ID44 from Audient before, and the preamp quality is practically identical in these, which is to say it's modern, it's clean, it's clear. It's got a lot of gain and very little noise, and as far as a modern interface goes, it's rock solid. However, it's the extra features that really push this above and beyond. Price-wise, it does reflect that. It's about £400 for one of these at the time of me making this video, which is not in the range of somebody looking for the cheapest of the cheap. But then that's not who this is aimed at. If you're a home recording guitarist and you want the utmost quality, then for something that has 2 channels in, 2 channels out, and an inbuilt reamp box, which I can't say enough about, that's a big thing. This has features that are completely different from what anybody else is doing. In this price bracket, there are things that you can get that roughly equate to this in the £1,000 plus market. I think it's Antelope making an interface with a reamp out, but that's way above the £1,000 mark, which is complete overkill for a lot of people. But reamping as a feature is a very desirable thing for someone who can only record their guitar parts at certain times, can't make noise apart from in certain circumstances maybe, and that's something that I identify with. When I'm not in the studio and when I'm at home, I have a 6-month-old baby. I can't have a 100-watt guitar amp cranked all the time, but at 10 o'clock at night I can go into our office, get something like the Sono with the inbuilt amp emulation there with no latency on it. I can play exactly what I need to play, I can make the mistakes, I can get it right over the span of an hour, a couple of hours. Then next time I can go to a place where I can make that kind of noise. I can bring something like the Sono with me, send those DI channels out of the 2 amp output to whatever amp setup I want to have roaring away, and press record, and then just let that do its thing. And then recording for me is then absolutely fantastic. I mean, yes, I have the studio to do that anyway, but I'm the edge case. There aren't that many like that, and I've spent so much money and time and all that kind of stuff on getting this set up, whereas now, for about £400, if you've already got the laptop, if you've already got the amp, all that kind of thing, you can just do that. And because this has got all the inbuilt cab modelling, inbuilt power amp modelling, you can take this to a show and you could, without the computer at all, just run this. It's got 3 cab presets in it, so you can switch between them. I've set it to be a 4x12, an open back 2x12, and a bass cab. And actually for the Celestian video that I did recently, the G1235XC video, I needed a bass part for that. And at home I didn't have any of my equipment with me apart from I had the Sono, laptop and a bass. So I got my bass, ran it through the tube preamp with quite a bit of drive to get the tube going. The tube power drive section from 2 Notes, and the Brit Fridge T, which is one of my hot pole cabs, by the way. Just as a clang to drop this in there, I sell plenty of cabinets through the 2 Notes store. Hopefully by the time you see this video I'll even have this, the absolute 4x12 monster in that store, and I can then load up those custom sounds, and I practically didn't have to mix that bass when I was recording it, getting back to that story, because the amp sound was right, everything was right. I didn't have any latency on it as I was tracking it because I just got the blend knob on the input so that I could hear it coming straight from the 2 Notes Torpedo remote hardware here. And if you wanted to do this separately, the Two Notes Torpedo cab pedal was about £400. They've got a new version, the Torpedo Cab M, coming out, which is still nearly £300 to use this technology separately. So then you've saved money if that's what you wanted by doing that. You've saved money by not having to get a reamp box. It's all there, it's all doable. So if you are someone who's going to be really into guitar, I really recommend the Sono. If you're not someone who's really doing guitar, I would probably recommend something like an ID22 or an ID44 if you need more channels, because they're geared more towards the general recording musician. But this, for guitarists and people who are interested in getting great guitar tones, is what I would go for. One last thing, full disclosure as always, I'm not being paid for this review. Audient sent this to me to play with. I've been part of the beta program, which is why I'm able to do this early. I've been helping to test the Sono and make sure there's no bugs in the system by the time it gets to you guys. I mean, I've been holding on to this, waiting for the Two Notes part of the hardware to come online. That's how early I've got this, but then I'm gonna have to send this back at some point, so this is just a non-paid review. So I hope you appreciate that this is fair and balanced. Thanks for watching, guys. If you appreciated this review, hit the like button, hit subscribe, there's loads more stuff like this coming out. And as always, a big thanks to our patrons through Patreon. If you guys gave us $1 a month or whatever it is, you'll get early access to these kinds of videos, and you get a direct connection to ask us all sorts of weird and wonderful questions. We're hoping to bring back the viewers' comments videos soon, so if you do want to become a patron, you'll get first shout at those kind of questions. Thanks for watching, we'll see you in the next video. Goodbye. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, feel free to check out our other videos, as you can find here, or check out our Facebook and Twitter, or our Patreon page, which helps us to make more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.